Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Southern Delaware Alliance to Racial Justice, welcome to our town hall where we are going to be discussing Christianity and racial justice. I promised I wasn't going to say anything, but actually I do have a few comments before we open it up to our moderator and a wonderful panel of clergy to discuss the topic. During our last 3 town halls, we met with government officials, legislators, law enforcement officials, youth, and distinguished writers in order to understand the ongoing structural racism that continues to hold millions of Americans in captivity, and environmental, intellectual, and emotional captivity. The invisible chains of oppression seem to continue. This evening, we are speaking with spiritual leaders on the same topic. In preparing for this evening's presentation, I was reminded of the following, quote, "In God we trust" is the official motto of the United States of America, adopted by the U.S. Congress in 1956. It is on all our paper currency and some of our coins. "In God we trust" is part of the 4th verse of the Star-Spangled Banner. A sticker with these words are on the police vehicles in many cities in California. As late as March 2020, the Oklahoma House of Representatives passed legislation to require all public buildings to display "In God We Trust." The Pledge of Allegiance, our Pledge of Allegiance, refers to one nation under God. In John 8:32, Jesus said, "And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." In a letter written by 3 Episcopal priests who referenced this biblical passage, the 3 women said in response, "If we speak these unflinching truths, the church may find its way to lead a nation that claims to trust in God." I believe that the church is in a position, and in fact has an obligation, through its commitment to the mandates of Christ and the significance of his crucifixion, to free themselves and then help free the country from its original sin, slavery. The Church of Christ has been a major influence in the lives of African Americans. That's our discussion tonight. Some have questioned why we did not include a rabbi and an imam to participate in tonight's discussion. More so than any other religion, and since the beginning of the Black man's journey in America, the Christian church continues to be a major influence in the lives of African Americans. Equally important, they are a major influence in white America and have the opportunity to lead their parishioners to accepting the concept of the beloved community and a full appreciation of the words, "In God we trust." Thank you for that opportunity to say those few words. I want to show you a video that was produced by Calvin Jackson, who always leads us through our town hall meetings. But before the video starts, I want to remind people, we save the last half hour always for the audience questions. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A section of your webinar. And at the last half hour, the panel and the moderator will respond. So before I introduce our moderator, Calvin, can we see the film?
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home. saw a band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home. And that's why I sing, swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home.
Thank you. And thus the theme for tonight. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Reverend Paula Mariano, who is currently serving as the transition minister for the Unitarian Universalist of Southern Delaware. Reverend Mariano, whose permanent home is Wilmington, Delaware, has been ministering in area congregations and in the community for many years. She spent many years as an alternatives to violence trainer in Delaware prisons and with citizens returning to the community from prison. She is co-founder of the Coalition to Dismantle the New Jim Crow and served on the original steering committee of the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice. And we are so grateful to her for helping to put us together. So she sort of gave birth to us. So I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Mariano for the rest of the evening, and she will introduce our very esteemed panel. It's all yours.
Yes, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Charlotte. But you and many others really were the birthers. I was happy to be a part of it. And the way you have grown and the work that you are doing is remarkable. It's only been, I don't know, 5, 6 years?
5 years.
5 years, and it's just, your growth has been remarkable. Before I introduce the panelists, I would like to just set a little bit of context to draw us back away from the election and the rising numbers of COVID to the summer of 2020, when America saw the way Black lives did not matter when they watched the death of George Floyd. That was a threshold point that simply changed us in the way that the civil rights protests of several generations ago changed the 60s. People who really had not been paying attention or were opposed seemed to be able, for many for the first time, many of us even more clearly, see that racial injustice, racism, is what in the church we call the original sin of the United States. And in that context, all of our churches that were historically present during the time when our culture was divided by race, and in years since where racism has still prevailed, we all in the white churches are calling ourselves to account. And in the African American churches, I can't say much because I'm going to actually ask them in a moment to talk about their experience of the intensification of change that has occurred really quite recently. So in our panel, we have, I'm just going to go in the order that I see you in the gallery, and Marjorie Burns, Reverend Marjorie Burns, Pastor Burns, is minister to both the Faith and Israel United Methodist Churches in Lewis. And then she collaborates, I understand, quite a bit with Reverend Vicky Gordy Stiff, who is the pastor at Epworth, United Methodist Church. And then, where'd my arrow go? Okay. And then there is Mark Harris, Reverend Mark Harris, who is the rector at, am I correct? The rector?
No, I'm a lowly assistant in retirement at St. Peter's.
Well, see, when I meet you for the first time, I should be asking these questions before I introduce you. And so
Enough, you know?
I think retirement, I was in retirement before this, and I'm going to retire again after this year. So I don't think retirement is lowly. I think it's a very sacred state. But anyway, Reverend Mark Harris is Episcopalian minister, retired from St. Peter's or somewhere else?
St. Peter's. I'm retired and working at St. Peter's. Just that's enough.
Okay, thank you. And Dania Griffin, we talked earlier. Dania says his name like we say names in Italian, pronouncing all the vowels. So Pastor Griffith, you're with the Antioch AME, and I did church, and I did look that up. It's in Frankfurt, right?
Yes, it is.
Oh,
Yes,
all right. Thank you for being here. And I think I covered everybody, right?
No, got Vicky.
I got Vicky.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I think that was everyone. So I kind of set the context. We're in a new age in terms of the opportunity to become, to heal the barriers of racism and to become a society where the rights of all people are recognized, and Black Lives Matter, making all lives mattering, because we can't have all lives mattering without Black Lives Mattering. So again, in the order of how I see you, I'm going to start. We talked on the phone, so I'm going to no.
Oh no!
It's always hard to be the first one, but you sounded so passionate on the phone. I thought you could handle the job. Can you describe how a preference for whiteness permeated Christianity's and your denomination's racial history, and describe if and how you see that changing today?
Okay, good evening, and thank you, Charlotte and the rest of the committee for inviting me to be a part of this dialogue. Now, I hope in answering this question, I'm going to try my best to stay under 3 minutes, okay? But Pastor Vicky can help me. I grew up United Methodist and went, different places, different denominations. But as I thought about this question, I had to go back to the history of the United Methodist Church, of Methodism. And our leader, John Wesley, our founder, he was an advocate in Britain, Europe, against slavery. Okay, and so when he brought Methodism over here to the United States, he remained an advocate against slavery. There were circuit riders and some women that spoke out against slavery also. But what I found really interesting was that the Methodist Church split over the issue of slavery. I have my little notes here, so I have my little cheat sheet, okay? Apparently in the 1840s, somewhere around up in there, the Northern Methodists and the Southern Methodists, it was a written rule that you were not to have, clergy were not to own slaves. Clergy and members, really, were not to own slaves. And apparently there was a bishop in Georgia who had inherited 2 slaves, but yet they had the freedom to leave his property, but chose not to. So he married, I guess when the first wife died, he married the second one. And the second wife, she had inherited slaves also from her deceased husband. But the word is he did not claim those slaves as his own. But that still caused an upheaval with the Northern Methodists. And what happened, make it real short, compress this, he was going to resign as bishop, but at the 1840 something General Conference, there was a long, lengthy days discussion of basically whether, I guess, he or any clergy members or members could own slaves. Was it ethical to own slaves and still be clergy? Because we're, the word is, Jesus said, we're to love one another and to love others as we love ourselves. So apparently the Southern Methodists didn't think it was basically wrong because that was the law of the land. It was legal to own slaves. Northern Methodists thought it was wrong. And so what happened is our church split, the Methodist church split, and it split over the issue, the painful issue of slavery, which basically was, to me, institutional racism, okay? And we, from my readings and understanding, I think it was 18 years before the South seceded from the country that Methodism, our church split and remained split, 94, 95, almost 100 years over the issue of slavery. And so, we got back together, blah, blah, blah. So where are we today? Where are we today? I believe that the United Methodist Church has made great strides in trying to eradicate racism, and especially in these past few years. There have been, I think there's a program called Dismantle Racism, and we're standing out with our social principles. We believe that racism is a sin. It is a sin. And we are not, if we are upholding it, we are not, following the rules, the command of Jesus to love God, to love our neighbor as ourselves, no matter who our neighbor is. I know that, there are other programs, Vital Conversations, our General Commission on Religion and Race has come out with all kinds of programs too, and events and Bible studies and prayer services and whatnot to help clergy and our congregants to find ways that we can eradicate racism, because it does not flow with the command from Jesus. So we have a long way to go, but we're I think we've made great strides.
Well, that's encouraging to hear, and thank you very much, Pastor Burns. Vicki, I'm going to bring in a male voice with Reverend Harris. Do you want to share? I need to read the question again for people? Let me do that one more time. Can you describe how a preference for whiteness permeated Christianity's and your denomination's racial history, and describe if and how that is changing today.
Well, yes. Let's see how to. The first thing I think I want to say is looked at as a world religion, Christianity is not predominantly white anymore, and was for most of its history prior to the invention of race as a social construct. People's snarling and growling with each other was determined by other factors, not principally by race. But the question is really about the preference in America for whiteness permeating the church. And I think that's primarily a product of the reason why the social construct of race arises. And my sense is that it grows out of an economic principle of scarcity. That is to say, my European ancestors who came to America, mostly on the lam, they were people who were the second sons, and they were the people who didn't have much in the way of money, and they came here to make their way. But it turns out that actually it's fairly labor intensive to make your way. So when you show up and there are Indians there, you enslave them. When you show up, if you can con somebody into coming over as an indentured servant, you do that. And when the slave trade, which was already happening in the Caribbean, began to start happening in the States, acquiring slaves was a piece of acquiring chattel. And we already knew something about acquiring chattel, because when we founded the United States of America, we very clearly said that all men are created equal, and we weren't fooling. Men are created equal. Women were chattel for all intents and purposes. You were owned property. Children were not only chattel, but they were kind of inferior chattel. And so slavery as an institution was, in a sense, a perfectly reasonable extension of how you take relatively scarce resource, namely your own energy, and multiply it, and therefore make a living, make money, become rich. So I believe that at least on one important level, the race narrative gets built to justify what everybody knows is really a matter of greed, right? And we all know, because we're all good Christians, we're not supposed to be greedy, but that's what we were, and that's what we produced. We produced a land in which some people subjugate other people on whatever excuse they can possibly find, and racism turned out to be a really interesting and engaged community activity of hiding the truth. So you could, in fact, own other people, right? Well, this really came to a head for what became the Episcopal Church in the colonial period. I did a little research, Marjorie, too. I kept working at it because I know I'd be in the same group with you. So I did a little bit of research about. It turns out that 1619, slavery begins in the colonies. By about 1630, the colony of Virginia was having to deal with the fact that there were Anglican clergy there who wanted to baptize slaves and bring them into the church and teach them the faith and, all the rest of that. Somebody has indicated that a number of the slaves were in fact Muslim by background. So what? We're gonna convert everybody, right? The problem is if you baptize somebody, they're now part of your crowd somehow. They're your brothers and sisters in faith. And the question was, can you baptize somebody and own them? The civil community, that is to say the courts of the legislature of Virginia, were as greedy as the rest of us, and they understood that if you did this, you're going to really mess up the character of the subjugation that you were involved in. So they passed a law that said baptism does not affect the status of slaves. And the thing is, the church went along with it. So the beginning of the kind of complicity is the complicity of the church with the state, or the church with the civil society. There were always some people, an example being, John Wesley is a perfect example of somebody who came out of the Anglican community who in fact got it, that this was wrong. There were plenty of people around who did that, but the institution itself made the compromise with the civil society, and that really continues on. That's one sort of example of the problem. Another problem being that at a church in Philadelphia, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, both an Episcopal church in Philadelphia, they both felt called first to be engaged in the church and in part of the leadership if possible, and that was rejected.
So Reverend Harris,
okay, you ready to have me shut up? Okay, so.
I think that dovetails nicely with the history. Do I have my history right with the AME?
Yeah, yeah, and this and the one main reason for raising it was to be able to segue into the AME experience. Richard Allen went in one direction, and he made his compromises in order to stay in the Episcopal Church. And Richard Allen took another direction and formed another church.
So let us.
We are 150 years later, and I think we are in the morass of beginning to figure out how to move beyond those kinds of divisions. And I think we're doing it more later, but on to others.
On to Pastor Griffin and more on that history. That was a great segue. Thank you, Reverend Harris.
Yes. The question was, can you describe how preference for whiteness permeated Christianity's racial history? There were two questions in the one question. And in order to go back, we're all doing research this evening. I think we want to be prepared for this conversation. And I think it goes back further than 1619. It does come to America, but it comes to America from the legitimization of trading people in Portugal. And in Portugal, there was I won't go into details, there was a captain who decided he wanted to make a gift to his prince, to his king of people. And he actually captured two Berbers and presented them to his king. It raised the question because at that time, this was around the 1450, the mid 15th century. The Catholic Church or the popes did a series of edicts or bulls. And one said that it amounted to Muslims, Jews, and Christians were not to be captured. Everybody else was Gentile. They could be captured and used as slaves. What the popes did at that time was then issued a series of edicts that said, okay, it's okay, not only over a period of about 50 years, it's not only okay to capture them and make them slaves, but to take their property and their possessions.
And their land.
And their property and their land and their possessions. That eventually led to when Chris Columbus came to these shores in 1492. And in 1493, once again, another bull was issued that said that Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, they had full and free authority, power, jurisdiction of every kind over the Americas to do anything they wanted to, including capture people. So to bring forward to the point, can you describe how the preference for whiteness, we still haven't gotten to whiteness yet. That translates to once you ascribe that kind of godly authority to people, because we want to keep it in the context of the Christian conversation. Once we have ascribed godly authority to the conversation, then you have men who are in it not for prophecy, but for profit. And it kind of pulls these pieces together. Then it becomes a question of what is expedient, and you can come down through the years to talk about how it evolved. Now, the difference is in America, it wasn't until, I think his name was Johann Blumenbach, who first coined the term, or is credited with coining the term Caucasian in Europe. And at that time, it became a question of not only separating Europeans from Americans, but more importantly, separating the races so that the white was elevated over the black. And the church even endorsed this concept. Now, and the AME church, as Mark had already referenced, our situation was a little bit different because Richard Allen was actually not only compromised, he was pleased to be worshiping with Methodists, with the Episcopal Church, because that's where he found Christ. And he maintained that allegiance through a lot of resistance, because that's where he found Christ. The formation of our church is that we were one of the few churches who have been started not because of theological concerns, but because of sociological issues. And it began when one morning at church, at St. George's Episcopal Church, Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, the black congregants had begun to outnumber the white congregants, and because of Richard Allen's preaching and not only his, but Aston Jones and others preaching, they began to outnumber the white congregants. And of course, when the numbers fall out of balance, then people begin to assert power. I'm trying to watch my time here, so I'm moving kind of fast. Bottom line is, one Sunday morning, it was prayer time, and Richard Allen and his followers were on their way to their seats when it was announced it's prayer time. So instead of going to their seats, which had been moved from where they normally sit to the back of the church or the upstairs of the church, they began to go to the altar. And no sooner had they knelt down to pray when one of the trustees or stewards, officers of the church, then said, "You can't." Richard Allen said it this way: "I heard a scuffle. I looked up, and there was a member of the church telling, I believe it was Absalom Jones, 'You can't kneel here.'" And that created a whole confusion. So eventually, the ultimate consequence was that 42 folk left St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church and moved to a building, to a property they'd already purchased in the building they were already in the process of building, and established what later became known. It was first the Free African Society, and then it became Bethel Church. Now, this was about 1786, 87. It took 39 years for them to have the first general conference and name themselves the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, in those 39 years, I'm almost done. In those 39 years, there was a series of actions by the Methodist Episcopal Church that tried to do everything to try to take the property from it. And in fact, they did, by hook and crook, steal the property from Sixth and Lombard from Richard Allen and his people. But there was threats of excommunicate, the Methodist version of excommunicate, which is read them out of the church. and there were constant threats giving bad preachers. So there was a sense, race was never an issue with Richard Allen. Race was the issue with the white worshipers. Not all of them, mind you. And it always reminds me that when we talk about racism, we're not necessarily talking about a black phenomenon per se. It's more of a power phenomenon as it's institutionalized from a white perspective. We have to be very careful that we approach that. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Pastor Griffin, and fascinating history. I could listen to each one of you for the rest of the night, but I'm not allowed to let you get away with that.
I know.
So, Reverend Gordy Stiff.
Sure. So obviously, Reverend Burns and I share the same tradition, and Reverend Griffin and I are also part of that, as is Reverend Mark, because we all kind of come out of originally the Anglican Church and then all the way over. But I want to focus a little bit differently. So one of the things that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, and I'm going to wildly paraphrase it, is that churches should be like thermometers that change the temperature of society. But too often we are like, or we should be like thermostats that change. But too often we're like thermometers that just reflect the temperature of society. And so I feel like when we look back in our United Methodist history, we can see that struggle. We can see where there are times when we try to change the temperature of society, but there are many, many times when we simply reflect the temperature of society. And so, as already has been mentioned, the United States was founded on its original sin of racism and white supremacy. And so even though John Wesley, when he sent people over and when he, really had started his societies and his bands and his classes, had a very egalitarian view, when that became institutionalized in the United States after particularly the Revolutionary War, then we went back to simply reflecting the temperature of society. And so people did own slaves and even clergy, as Reverend Burns has mentioned. There were times when you would see kind of these breakouts where, again, you can look at the split in 1844 of the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, as the Methodist Episcopal Church taking a stand. But, even then they weren't exactly egalitarian. And you can see the ways that they treated people differently. And so white was still the norm. And that's the whole part of white supremacy, is where white is seen as the norm, and you put power behind that, you put policy behind that. And so then we made so many compromises that didn't hold up to what we thought were our values. And so even when the church came back together again in 1939, one of the compromises with the Methodist Episcopal Church South was that they did not want to have a black bishop, for one thing. And so they wanted to create a structure where they would never have to answer to a black bishop. And so we created this central jurisdiction, which was a whole segregated system. So here we were supposed to be coming back together again, and yet we compromised again. And so we, again, reflected what was going on in society instead of taking the lead and letting God and our understanding of Jesus as liberator, as God as the freer of people who brought the slaves out of Egypt. Instead of looking to who we were, we just gave into society. And then I think that happened again in 1968, where, there was this great merger where everyone came back to get together again, and we abolished the central jurisdiction. And yet there were no provisions for sharing of power and for making sure that, that the policies and the processes in place were going to equally benefit our African-American sisters and brothers in churches, as well as our white churches. And so it was almost as if we just subsumed the Black churches into the white structure, and therefore, because they were different, they became inferior once again. So they did not get the kinds of support and the kind of equality that they were hoping for. And yet throughout the history, you see glimpses of hope. And for me, that's where the Holy Spirit breaks through, even in the midst of our sinfulness. One of the things that really shocked me was that the United Methodist women in the United Methodist Episcopal Church, or in the Methodist Episcopal Church South, formed an anti-lynching league. And so, you know, there were women who were saying, this is not fair. And they would, you know, there's a great story about a woman who interrupted her Christmas dinner because she heard that someone was going to be lynched. And she marched herself down to the sheriff's office and she said, I am telling you that this person's going to be lynched. And if you don't go and do something to stop it, you are implicit. And she called all of her friends and they all went down to where that mob was gathering, and the man did not get lynched. Now, I wish I could say that happened over and over and over again, but I don't think we would have heard that story if it happened frequently. But again, for me, that is the Holy Spirit breaking through and the church saying, no, we are going to be that thermostat. We can change the temperature of society. But I think for far too often, what it is meant to be United Methodist is white. And so, you know, for our African-American sisters and brothers, they are seen as other and not as part of the original structure or the original intention of United Methodism. And therefore, the worship is not valued as much, their input is not valued as much, and the power is not shared equally across the racial lines. And so too often we have merely reflected the temperature of society instead of tried to change it. So I'm going to stop there because you all have done a great job in all the other history, but that's kind of, but here's one little backstory just to kind of put something in perspective. In 1965, the Peninsula and the Delaware conferences decided ahead of the General Conference in 1968 that they were going to merge. So the Delaware Conference was a traditionally Black annual conference and the Peninsula Conference was a white annual conference. And in that merger, and actually a few years before that merger, there was a church that was intentionally integrated, Silverbrook United Methodist Church in Wilmington, Delaware. And it was intentionally integrated to the point where there were two pastors, one was African-American, one was white. There were two choir directors, one who would teach the choir, African-American, who would teach the choir the spiritual traditions and ways to sing in a different style, and then the white who would teach everybody, you know, the more European tradition of music. And that's where I grew up. That was the church I grew up in, and my father was the pastor. And the fascinating thing, though, is that at the time, the other Methodist churches in Wilmington decided that if people left Silverbrook because of the integration, they would not let them join the other Methodist churches. They would let them attend because they couldn't tell them not to worship there, but they would not accept their transfer of membership because they, you know, figured it was because of racism and because of that underlying sin of racism. And, you know, to see that solidarity way back in 66, you know, 67, that hasn't happened, I don't think, since until this past summer, when we really are seeing more of the Black Lives Movement and other protests are multicultural. They're not simply the African Americans crying out. And so that does give me hope that, again, there have been glimpses of the Holy Spirit breaking through, but that oftentimes we still tend to reflect our society, which is very much white supremacist.
Whew.
Very good.
Not because it's so long, but there's so much, and there's so much that we have to acknowledge, repent, and move on from to get to a better place. And the better place is what we'll be talking about now. I'm not sure we have, I'm going to ask you to, really take a look at your time on this, because otherwise people won't get a chance to ask their questions. All of us, I mean, I think each one, as I said, could be a lecture that you could all give an hour and a half on. What do you believe is needed from the top leaders of Christian denominations and churches to help Christians respond with compassionate justice to those racially oppressed within their own community and within the Christian faith? And that one is going to segue into one that takes us more into general society. So I'm going to ask for a volunteer on this one to start. And if I don't get a volunteer, I'm going to call on Reverend Harris.
Okay. I've been really surprised and delighted that the top leadership of the Episcopal Church in the past now 12 years has consisted of the first woman presiding bishop and now the first African-American presiding bishop, in order, one after the other. Between the two of them, there's been a huge swath of new sensibilities that have come in, and they've come in because in both of these cases, these leaders have come in at tough times for the church. And Presiding Bishop Michael Curry is our current presiding bishop, is African-American, very strongly related to the wider African-American Christian community's experience of the church. So he's not a stuffy Episcopalian. He's an amazing character. But part of his amazing character is that he takes seriously the issue about compassionate justice and does so from a very pastoral standpoint. The reason why that's an important piece is I think the leaders of our local churches, like our rector, Jeffrey Ross, have a sense of pastoral compassion that involves not just their own congregation, but the community as a whole, and therefore are likely then to be able to talk about the needs to pay attention to and overcome the kind of oppressiveness of white supremacy, but the oppressiveness that is exercised in a variety of ways, and to move to some place where oppression is not a dominant characteristic of our interactions with each other. So I see some real promise, but I think what's needed is leadership that is not only intellectually capable and faith capable in terms of being able to lead on that level, but whose personal level of compassion is kind of clear and kind of witnessed in their presence. So I see leadership needing to be both pointing a direction, but also living it out. I guess that's the way to say it. That's it.
All right, thank you very much. Marjorie? Reverend Harris, I'm sorry. Are you there?
I am. Who do you want? Who do you want now?
What do you want?
I asked for Reverend Pastor Harris. Not Harris, Burns.
Hi, Marjorie.
Hi, Pastor Harris. Okay. If I could just, I guess, piggyback on my answer is very, very simple. And for me, it is what's needed at the top is to ask clergy to ask, you know, in what ways is God calling me to live out his command to love my neighbor as myself? And then I go into Michael 6:8, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God, and then act accordingly. And although that's simple, it's not, because what I believe it calls every leader and top leaders is to we have to pull ourselves out of that comfort zone, because we do fall into a comfort zone. And I believe that the racial awakening, if I can use that word, in our country at this moment is calling every clergy person from, I guess, from bishops on down to the local church, to come out of our comfort zone and to really have an honest conversation with ourselves. You know, where am I? You know, in all of this. You know, am I a racist? You know, and I'm just not talking about whites. I'm talking about African Americans too, because we can be racist in our own group. Truth be told, but for me, it is to pull ourselves out of our comfort zone. And last week, Pastor Vicky said something that really, you know, jiggled my mind, and that is to take our baptismal vows seriously, to speak up, and to resist evil and justice and oppression in whatever means they present themselves. If we, the top leaders, bishops on to local clergy, if we aren't doing anything, and if we are being comfortable in our little comfort zones, you know, we don't want to rock the boat per se, then how do we expect our congregations, how do we expect to make an impact? How do we expect them to follow the teachings of Christ if we aren't following them? So I believe it depends on us. We must come out of our comfort zone. It's as simple as I can get it.
And thank you. It may sound, as you said, it may sound simple, but it's not easy work to come out, for anyone to come out of our comfort zone. And
yeah,
clergy are people too, and so we have to make this same kind of effort that others would do in their context.
mm-hmm.
Now, I'm looking at the time. It's 5:08, and Charlotte says they like to have a half hour for questions. So I thought, you know, from the participants. So I thought we could consult here with Charlotte for just a moment. Charlotte.
Hi, thank you.
Skip the third question.
I think we have time to finish up the second question, because I'd like to hear what the other two pastors have to say. And I think your third question is important. I don't think your fourth question. I think we'll hold that and we'll let the audience participate after we finish the second.
Yeah, I was going to finish the second, but I thought that might be the end of it.
Right. No, I think we can go to the third question, and then if we can be succinct, and I think those last answers were wonderful and succinct. And then we can open up to the audience, because that will lead to more discussion, which is what we want.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Charlotte.
I'm going back into hiding. Thank you.
I appreciate the consult. Dania, Pastor Griffin.
Dania's fine.
And you said that from the beginning, but I wanted to be respectful. So Pastor Griffin, do you want to answer the second question? And should I repeat it?
No, I'd just like to dive right in. Martin Luther King, we reference him a lot, and he talked about 11 o'clock on Sunday being the most segregated hour in America. A recent study was done in 2018 that showed the difference between white churchgoers and white non-religious persons. And it stated that white evangelical Protestants were 85% more likely to be racist. White Catholics were 71% more likely to be racist. White mainline Protestants were 64% over the non-church attending white person to be racist. And it even diverged even in a different, more differently or more strictly. Amongst white mainline Protestants and white Catholics, the more you go to church, the less racist you were, they found. Among evangelical Protestants, there was a direct relationship between church attendance and increased racist thinking. So to me, the question really is, what is being taught, what is being practiced, and what is being preached? And to go to the answer to your question is what is needed from the top leaders of Christian denominations and churches to help Christians respond with compassionate love. Questions were asked like, those who were evangelical believed that Blacks were more likely to be responsible for their own situation, that racism, that slavery had little impact on minorities' present situation. Totally inconsistent with what all the data shows. So I think if I really had like 1, 2, 3, 4 words, but if the leaders would teach, preach, and practice the ethic of Christian love, not as we want it to be, but not what's politically expedient, but as Christ taught it, and make that, and then practice that in our walk and our talk, then I believe that compassion, compassion is another biblical word for love. Compassion just leads into love, and you can't love and hate at the same time. So I believe that our goal should be adhere more closely to the doctrine of the biblical Jesus, and not the social political one that we've created and that we continue to maintain.
Thank you. Reverend Vicki Gordon-Stith.
Sure. So I really appreciate what everyone said. I think just a couple of thoughts I've had. One is that I'm a big fan of Brene Brown, and I really think that as leaders, we need to overcome the sense of shame, because shame keeps us from talking about racism. And I'm not talking about white fragility, I'm talking about shame. So, you know, if we have a sense of shame, we're not going to be vulnerable and admit that we don't know everything, and we're not going to be willing to learn. And I think, you know, this sense of, one of the things I love about Methodist theology is that salvation is a process, and that we're going on to perfection. And so, you know, as leaders, we need to be teaching that racism is a sin that we need to be saved from, and that it's going to be a lifelong process, because that culture, the white supremacist culture, is the air that we breathe. And so we need to see it, we need to identify it, and then we need to learn to repent of it and learn different strategies for how to behave. And I think this needs to start from the top. And I think it needs to move beyond words, you know, services of repentance, whatever. I mean, that's words, but you know, it needs to be actions where we focus on policies, where we focus on practices, where we focus on things that, where that power lies. that impact the relationships and that impact those who are oppressed. And so I think as we gain this courage to be vulnerable and to begin to see our own culture, one of the things that I do, I'm an IDI qualified administrator, and IDI is the Intercultural Developmental Inventory. And many, many people fall in the category of minimization, which means that they don't see their culture. So they think that white is just the norm. And so they don't see their own culture as being culture. And so trying to open our eyes to see and really help people discover what is our culture and the ways that we oppress people with our culture and through our culture. And I think that requires great vulnerability at the top leadership. And it requires that we look at all of those policies that continue to keep people in those places of oppression. And for me, when I think about scripture, I think about perfect love casts out fear. And so, when we allow ourselves to be filled more with God's love, then we don't have to be afraid to say, I messed up, or that, I was acting out of my white supremacy and I want to learn, I want to be different, I want to grow. And I think trying to train our pastors and our lay leaders, because I think we do a lot in the Methodist Church to train our pastors, but we have nothing equivalent to train our lay people. And so pastors go back to their churches without the tools that they need to help their people see that they are living in a white supremacist culture. And therefore, then we can't be a part of that transformation that we're asking the church to be a part of. So, giving people tools, helping the laity learn about their own implicity in white supremacy, and also getting rid of the shame so that we can be courageous and be vulnerable and continue to learn and grow as we overcome the sin of white supremacy.
Thank you so much. And I really like the way you parsed shame and white fragility too, because they are different. They really are. That could be a whole other meeting. All right, so I'm going to the third and last question. How can Christians today participate in confronting and transforming our white supremacy culture, moving us towards what Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. described as the beloved community, and following the call of Jesus to love your neighbor as yourself? And I believe that pieces of the answers to that question have been throughout what you've been sharing. So maybe you can just kind of pull out and summarize what you want to offer this time. Reverend Harris, I'm back to you.
Okay. In the Episcopal Church, there's been a growing effort in the past few years under the banner of becoming the beloved community that's really kind of taken off, and the events of this last summer in particular sort of honed it in more than it would have otherwise been. But it's very much following what Pastor Vicky suggests, namely that there's a need for education by and among white people about what it is that we've been complicit in or cooperative in, or even sometimes encouraging, that has to do with continuing racist practices and racial injustice. And so there's been a growing effort to do kind of that interior education. And it's resulted in something called the Sacred Ground program, which two members of our parish are leading a local group, listening to a series of talks, a curriculum around hearing from groups that have been oppressed about what that's about, and then discussing something about what does that mean for our future, kind of thing. I think it's a very powerful kind of program. I think it's the kind of thing that needs to be repeated over and over and over again. At the same time, in our diocese, there's been for a long time a parallel to what Pastor Vicky talked about in terms of the Methodist experiment from many years ago about a joint parish or a joint congregation of one that was African American and one that was white coming together. And again, St. Andrews and St. Matthew's in Wilmington was that experiment. And that's continued to the present and is quite successful and is going well. A warning, this stuff actually eats up people if you're not careful. The two founding pastors of that joint congregation, and they had joint pastors at that point, both kind of went down in flames. I mean, the costs are exhausting, even when it's done by people of very good will. And I think we need to be careful to take care of one another in this process. It seems to me it doesn't do to have a beloved community that just collapses under the weight, right? We have to be able to find times to appreciate one another with some joy and some delight in being with one another. If this turns out to be nothing but hard work, after a while, you just have a bunch of dead people, and that's no good. So my encouragement on this would be that becoming the beloved community is both a matter of education and faith development. It's also a matter of learning literally how to love one another, how to take care of each other through all this stuff. I believe the church is equipped to do that if it's willing to take the challenge. The question is whether it's willing to do that. I'm hopeful, at least. And there's some signs that, in fact, that's going to work.
Well, that's a good note to end yours, your comments on. And I'm going to go to, again, to Reverend Burns.
Okay. I went to Dr. King's quote about the beloved community, and I just want to share this. He says, the beloved community is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. And so racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. And so for me, when I read that quote, I went back to, where do we start? Where do we start? And for me, it was, it is going back to the beginning of racism, why we had racism, why, it sprung up, the monster sprung up, and the policies and the rules that are in place today that continue to feed into racism. So I guess it goes, for me, it went back to asking myself as a Christian, who am I? Am I a follower of Christ? And if I am a follower of Christ, then what am I supposed to be doing to eradicate racism and build up this beloved community? How can I, if I can't be effective in changing policy, what can I do? Prayer, what can I do? Can I sit and listen to people of other, races and try to understand their pain and their suffering? Can I go out and demonstrate? What can I do to eradicate so the pain and the hurt and the evilness of racism, so that, and begin to build up this beloved community where all people are created, not just in the words, but we are all created equal. And so how can I put that, help build that new quote unquote beloved community? And for me, it's not, you know, it would take a while. It took hundreds of years for us to get here, and it's hundreds of years to eradicate and to build up at the same time, build up the beloved community. But it's a one-on-one. I still go back to, it's a one-on-one. It is a heart, a transformation of our mind, and it is a heart transforming. How, you know, if I'm the only one in my family that's going to look at racism on all levels as evil, then I'm the only one. And I have to get out there and do what needs to be done to help build this beloved community. And hopefully and prayerfully, others will follow behind me.
Hopefully. Yes. Yes. Pastor Dania Griffin. I like saying your name, Dania.
Thank you. Martin Luther King, I too join Reverend Burns in going through the quotes of Martin Luther King as it relates to the beloved community. And the one I found interesting was, love is the creative and redemptive. Love builds up and unites. Hate tears down and destroys. The aftermath of the fight with fire method, which you suggest, is bitterness and chaos. The aftermath of the love method is reconciliation and creation of the beloved community. Physical force can repress, restrain, coerce, destroy. Yes, love, which means understanding, creative, redemptive, goodwill, even for one's enemies, is a solution to the race problem. I only add to that when we talk about beloved community, there's a certain presumption or assumption in that conversation, and that's an assumption of equality. If you're talking from a power relationship where you have one group giving the other person the right to call themselves human, that's not equality. You have a situation where you have one group having to beg for recognition and say, I matter too. That's not equality, and that's not lending itself to solving the racial or healing the racial wounds of America. Equality obviates the need to assert equality. Circular but true. If you can't see me until you see me, not as a threat, not as an enemy, not as 3/5, half, or anything less than a whole person. Historically, the church has done its part in constructing and sustaining differential treatment by race, the so-called Mark of Cain, Noah's curse, using scripture to justify inequalities. But the beloved community is not acquiescing, going along to get along. Someday my prince will come proposition. It's a call for action for everyone who calls himself a Christian. It's a call for respect. It's a call for recognition. It's a call for isness. Pulpits have to preach not politics, but Christ. We got to change the news cycle. Publicly call out evil. If it's a hate group, call it a hate group and say you're against that group. It's not so much to say I'm for something. We're all for goodness and a full plate, but are we against somebody denying somebody else that opportunity? And the beloved community, that need is not there if we're all equal. But if we're all equal in the beloved community, it eliminates itself. Are we ministers or merchants, clerics or Gnostics, orators or proclaimers? In all of our communities, we need to show some love of self, some love of Christian love, our love of our neighbors and our friends and our enemies, because Christ told us to love to love one another. By this, we will all show the world that we are his disciples. Ultimately, that's the answer for a Christian community. And to become a beloved community, we all have to aspire. And something Sister Vicky said, which I think is true, in Methodism, it's a beautiful piece, because we don't think you get saved on this side of glory. You get perfected on this side of glory. and then you move on. Once you're perfected, you go through the process. It's a day by day, minute by minute. As Reverend Burns said, it's a one person by one person, build a wall one brick at a time. But if we do that, then we can build a beloved community.
Thank you. What powerful messages we're hearing, and we have one more. Reverend Gordy Stiff.
Thank you. Again, thank you all. I really appreciate your words, and it makes me think even more, which is wonderful. I love these kinds of dialogues. I think for me, a big piece of this is the Imago Dei, that all of us are created in the very image of God. And so if we harm a sister or brother in Christ, we are harming God. We are harming the image of God in them. And, you know, so, and Jesus said, you know, you do it to the least of these, you do it to me. And so it's that same sort of sense that helping people come to terms with the fact that every single person on this earth is created in God's image and therefore is sacred. Therefore, we are called to love the way that Jesus loved in that sacrificial manner. And I think for me, it's that let there be peace on earth and let it begin with me. That, you know, as a leader, I have to model that and I have to teach it and I have to help create a community, my church as a community that will fight these injustices and that will work towards that beloved community. And so one of the things that I've been doing recently with my staff is we are studying the book together. We take about an hour and a half of our staff meeting every week to discuss Ibram Kendi's How to Become an Anti-Racist. And I'm really proud of them because they are really wrestling with needing to see themselves and their behavior in a new light. And they have been, you know, because we are sadly a white staff, I think they are able to say, oh my gosh, like I have really come to see that I, you know, have done a lot of things wrong. And, you know, I think having those safe places where we can uncover that, but also not burdening our African-American sisters and brothers all the time by saying, teach us, teach us, teach us. When, you know, I know friends of mine have said, we've taught you, you know, what more do you need? We need to learn it. We need to discuss it amongst ourselves, and we need to embrace our own need to learn what we need to do to live into that Imago Dei, that image of God, and recognizing that in everyone. And so I think as we begin with leaders within our church, and then, you know, we grow and we expand, we give people tools to say, how can you be an interrupter in this oppressive system that we live in? And whether that is, you know, joining a protest is a great way of interruption. But we also talked about if you see someone who's being harassed by police, pull out your camera and start videoing. You know, and finding ways and tools, because oftentimes people get stuck in the moment. But if you can give people tools to say, if you see this happening, here are some ways that you can get involved. And I think it moves beyond just, you know, those negative encounters to also building on the positive encounters. So we have started looking for, we haven't gotten very far yet, but we've started looking for what are the African-American owned businesses in the Lewis Rehoboth area, because we want to you know, start patronizing those businesses as a way of affirming, as a way of building up the economic power of our African-American sisters and brothers, as a way of taking specific tangible action that starts to tip the balance and say, you know, we want all of us to be fed. We want all of us to be loved. We want all of us to be housed in a safe place and warm place. And, you know, all of these things that go beyond just, you know, that whole separate but equal, which we're still living in a lot of ways.
In a lot of ways we are, and you are right. It's important that we all go beyond that. And this has been a really very powerful presentation from all of you. And not done yet because there are people who have questions of you. Calvin, are you going to ask those questions or do you want me to do that?
No, I can ask them.
Thank you.
So,
I don't think you were introduced. Does everybody know Calvin Jackson, who is operating this program for us tonight?
Calvin is the director or the in charge of the heart of the Alliance. He is our communications, social media director, and he has produced and directed all of our virtual town hall meetings. So we could not live without Calvin. But Calvin, before you ask the question, I want to get back to something you said, Vicki. Vicki, one of our members has compiled a list of all the Black-owned businesses in the county. We will send you that list. There are none in Lewis, by the way, but we will send you the list.
Awesome. Thank you very much. That'll be great. Thank you.
Copy all of we participants, if you prefer it.
Pardon me?
I said copy us all. All right, Calvin, thank you.
well, I would like to thank each of the panelists. I mean, this really has been a powerful and informative discussion. I think it's one that we really needed to have. So first question, can you address the fact that the Bible talks of slaves as a means of justification?
Who would like?
Who wants to answer that? Oh, I see. I think you're muted.
Yeah, I realize. I understand in the context of slavery then and chattel slavery. Slavery then was not you own a person, you gain their services. Difference with chattel slavery is you own the person lock, stock, and barrel. In fact, they were not persons. They were less than persons. They were, for voting purposes and for electoral purposes, 3/5 of a person. And that's one of the issues with, as I was doing research partly for this presentation, it was the way that particularly Romans and Romans, the first 3 verses of Romans chapter, I believe was 13, it affirmed that slaves should always, that we should all be subservient to power, but the presumption was righteous power. And when we have unrighteous power, then it's every believing person's responsibility to usurp that power, to stand against it and to move against it. So the Bible does speak of slavery, and almost every patriarch had some type of servant. If you go through the Old Testament, but a servant then and a slave in 1864, 65, they were 2 different animals. And again, it was chattel slavery, which is ownership, versus just getting their service for a period of time, gaining service for a period of time.
I'd like to build on that. If I could, I'd like to build on that just a little bit. It's interesting that slaves were counted as 3/4 of a person in terms of determining the Electoral College and other monstrosities like that, rumph, but they actually didn't have any vote at all, right? I mean, so that they were only placeholders. I think one of the things that's amazing about what the difference between modern slavery and slavery in the ancient world, at least my understanding is the reduction of people to being simply property that's of value to producers is the ultimate insult of the working class. We reduce the working class to slaves whose only purpose for existence is to make it possible for the people who have money to make more money. And that's a very different, or at least it seems to be a very different sense of what slavery is about than what was the case where you had Greek slaves who were the teachers of the elite and therefore were more educated than most of the elite in Roman society. I mean, it's a very different game. I think modern slavery in America was the full mechanization of human beings. it turned them into pieces of the machine. And therefore they were replaceable. And in fact, one of the great problems was that it was actually more expensive to take care of slaves than it was to simply use them up, spit them out, and get new ones. That's a machine attitude towards human being. And it has the same failures that the objectification of workers into being simply pawns of an economic system. That's the ultimate, it's the ultimate insult of the working class. You see, I think mutter, mutter, mutter. That's my thoughts.
It was more than muttering. Way more, thank you.
All right, so here's, anyone else want to add anything?
I would like to add to what Mark just says, not just the ultimate insult to the working class, it's the ultimate insult to the human being.
Mm-hmm.
That you don't matter, you don't count.
Mm-hmm.
You're just here for, as he said, for my service, my pleasure, and then for me to dismiss you.
Mm-hmm.
Discard you.
Any other panelists want to answer or, all right. So how this is what I'm interested in. How did the Baptists come about? Are the majority of African Americans Baptists? And I can tell you, I started out as a Baptist, then I became a Methodist, then I became a Baptist again. Now I'm sort of somewhere in between. So how did the Baptists come about?
I have a little bit of an opinion about it, but you can shoot me down in a hurry, which is, I believe one of the great attractions of the Baptist Church is adult believers gather together and they choose their own pastors from within their communities. So a Black community separated out from other kinds of systems could in fact baptize among themselves and elect their own preachers or ordain their own preachers, essentially. It's very, very congregational, and therefore it's very available to small broken communities, communities that are oppressed. I think there's a parallel, I believe, but don't push me, in some parts of Tsarist Russia and even into the Soviet system, that Baptists it was a very attractive way of presenting Christianity to oppressed people who did not have access to larger organizational structures. So every Baptist congregation is its own thing. They elect their own leadership. I think that's something of why that was the case. Am I shooting in the right direction or not?
Well, since there are no Baptists here, on
A
the,
hard question to answer, yeah.
we don't know for sure. But Charlotte, maybe the next panel has to include a Baptist minister.
Could be. But meanwhile, we have so little time left, and I see, Calvin, that there are 5 really great questions left. One from Don Peterson, which is addressed specifically to Reverend Vicky. And I wonder if you could ask that one.
Yeah. So Reverend Vicky, so Epworth made the decision to erect a large Black Lives Matter sign at its entrance.
Can't hear you, Calvin.
Epworth made the decision to erect a large Black Lives Matter sign at its entrance. How did you bring the congregation to that decision, and what has been the impact?
That's a very interesting question. So we actually have a group of people who are part of a movement called Bridging the Divide, which works with Reverend Burns's churches, the Lewis Charge, Faith in Israel. And we have, they've met, and I was at a retreat with them in January before COVID hit, and we've had a lot of wonderful conversations. They studied the New Jim Crow together, and there have just been a lot of good relationship building pieces. So our group, that is our social justice group, includes people from not only Epworth, but also from Faith in Israel, and also from Seaside Jewish Community. And they brought forward a request for a sign that says Black Lives Matter. And so we had conversation in various ministry team groups about it, and then brought it to our governing board, and it was a unanimous decision to go ahead and put the Black Lives Matter sign up. So a week and a half ago on a Saturday, someone actually tore the sign down and ripped out the, we were going to just hang another sign up, but they ripped out the hanging, the D-rings and the springs and everything else. So we've had to have it repaired. But since then, I've actually had a couple of people from my congregation come and talk to me who were upset with Black Lives Matter because I believe, sadly, that there have been some news networks, conservative news networks, that have effectively rebranded Black Lives Matter from a movement of people who are saying Black Lives Matter to a, they equate them and hold them accountable for all of the looting, for all of the, for any violence that breaks out. So again, suddenly we're blaming the African-American population for any violence, no matter who provoked it or how it came about. And so, I've had a couple of people come and say, Black Lives Matter is a political statement. And I said, well, all Christian statements are political statements. But, they really struggled with, they said, stop racism now, or put, something else. So we wrestled with it some more. One of the things I wanted to do was put up a sign that said, racist actions and tearing down signs won't silence the cry for justice. Black Lives Matter. But we decided that would be taunting, and I didn't want to taunt. So we did replace it finally today with the statement that all lives cannot matter until Black lives do. Stop racism. And so it's been actually, most of our congregation agreed. We found that there were pockets that did not, but it has brought up wonderful opportunities for dialogue around Black Lives Matter, around protest movements, around ways that we can work to be effective and active members to try to stop racism. We did get a lot of calls from the community that were against it. Of course, the people who are for it probably aren't going to call us, so, but not members of Epworth, but from the community that were very angry, violent, so it didn't surprise me, sadly, that the sign got torn down. But I was, I do feel like that the congregation followed a really healthy, good process to put it up, and that we're going to continue to put signs up like that, even if that only just gets the dialogue started. So.
Thank you. In our UU churches, we found almost all of the big signs, the Black Lives Matter signs, have been torn down and had to be replaced. And the same thing, the hanging or the stands or whatever they were in.
So since the next question, since the events of the past summer, have you preached any of your Sunday sermons on the evils of racism and how Christians are called to work towards its eradication? And if so, what was the reaction of your parishioners?
So I have, I preached my Pentecost sermon on racism, and partly also shared a personal story. My youngest son, we adopted out of foster care, and his birth mother was African-American and his birth father was Puerto Rican. And he was shot and killed 2 years ago. And so, addressing systemic racism through the eyes of being his mother was part of that sermon. But we have also, my husband has preached a couple of sermons, as have I, throughout the summer, just trying to bring up anytime something new happens, which sadly is just about weekly, But, you know, trying to address it as the sin that it is and inviting people to find ways to be anti-racist in the midst of this white supremacist culture. And mostly we've gotten very, very positive response from the congregation.
Would anyone else like to respond?
I would say ministering to a Black congregation, and not solely Black, but a high percentage of Black congregation. We don't have to talk as much about racism because, I mean, we live it every day. And the real challenge for me has been, how do I take the Bible story and put this in context? And so what I believe God has led me to do is to not talk about racism as much as talk about how God does sustain. I refuse to give the enemy room in my message other than to say he exists unless this is how God fights him. And I think, I feel like as I've talked to my congregation, that's been a good approach. But there was a concern early on because I was trying to do I was trying to tippy-toe through it. And I had a couple of members say to me, "You're not speaking to our need. We need to hear that you hear and that God hears." And then so that freed me up to do what God had already instructed me to do. And so I think in our congregation, as a Black congregation, racism, as I said earlier, is not a new thing. I think it's new in the sense that in the larger community, in the white community, we've lived under the rubric for so long that it was a figment of our imagination, until what happened this summer was everybody was not working, was free for the day, not distracted. And we got to all see racism in George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. We got to see it in action, and not just the act itself, but the response to it, and how there was a differential relationship between police, political leaders, and people of color, people of poverty. And I think so. For me, it's just been a growing up experience for me in pastoring and preaching.
For me, I haven't, of course, like Pastor Dina, Pastor Griffin. I don't want to mess up your first name. It hasn't been teaching about racism. I mean, we live it. It's more of how can we as Christians find ways to eradicate injustice, and how can we live out that command to love God and to love others as ourselves, and to love ourselves so that we aren't hurting other people, and to also to help the least of our brothers and sisters. And the least of our brothers and sisters may be that white brother or sister who may have all of the material things, but are the least in their views on racism, their views on social justice. So how can we extend the hand of fellowship? How can we ourselves go over, jump over that hurdle of racism and move beyond our hurt and our pain, and to help our white brothers and sisters so that we can become, the community that God has called us to be. And for me, another thing is that the bridging the divide. We've been in this for 3 years. And I believe that, through that ministry between Faith and Israel and Epworth, we have developed some relationships. We have gotten to know, really, really know one another. And I believe that it's a start. It's a start. So, and, teaching about, preaching on the evilness then and today. So, like I said, we live with racism. So we try to find ways to, comfort one another on Sunday morning.
I like to also add that in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, despite our beginnings, our church has never denied access to anybody by race, by creed, As a matter of fact, during the yellow fever, I believe it was in Philadelphia, it was Richard Allen and his companions who worked for the city to help alleviate that burden. We found that the gospel of Jesus Christ, purely preached, welcomes everybody. Rightly preached. I won't say purely, rightly preached. And that's true for all. It should be true, I believe, for all Christians, but we do, that's our practice. That's all I've ever heard. That's all I believe. That's what I believe.
So looks like we have maybe 20 minutes left. So I want to get through a few more of these questions. So Reverend Harris mentioned that 2 Methodist churches, one black and one white, combined their congregations into one congregation, and that it was a very successful endeavor. Do any of the rest of you know of any other examples of a black and white church of the same faith joining together and becoming one congregation?
Let me say, I was echoing Pastor Vicky's experience in the Methodist Church by the parallel one in the Episcopal Church. So that's 2 different churches that did it.
So there you go. Okay.
Let me say, I think there's a need for some of us clergy as well as lay people to become practitioners of visitation to one another. I'm not sure at all that there's a great advantage to artificially melding together congregations. When it happens because it's a good idea, then it works. But I've taken up the practice as I can every couple of months, either going over to Friendship Baptist or going over to St. George's AME Church. I can afford to do that because I'm retired, and occasionally I can tell my boss that I've got other things to do. But actually, they're the same thing. It's the business of going to church on Sunday morning with a group of believers, and yeah, it's different, and yeah, you sort of have to work it out, and we have to become more elastic with one another. I mean, that is to say, to be open to sort of what the gifts of the Spirit are in whatever church we happen to be in. The successful ventures, I gather, of both St. Andrew's and St. Matthew's and of the Methodist Church in Wilmington really had to do with intentionality. They were doing it on purpose. And I think we can do on purpose, visiting one another with a spirit of grace and enjoyment. And that begins to develop a different kind of family. Then you don't care where you go to church. You're with people, right? Which I certainly hope we get to do soon. I'm getting tired of this not having to be with people stuff.
All right, thank you. So as churches have begun to preach the beloved community, church as an institution that needs to preach equality in God's image, how have the congregations of the churches represented responded? Has church membership, each of your congregations increased or declined? And I guess now it's a little, we're living in unusual times, but. But can you tell if your church membership has increased or decreased?
My church has increased a little bit. It has increased a little. Unofficially, probably about 5. Officially, thus far 1, but 1 is contemplating. And I think it's amazing is that we do, before COVID, we had at Israel, There was a friend of my girlfriend, she white, and who just loved Israel, the worship services and the people. And she is one of the very first ones on Zoom. We are doing Zoom, and she's one of the very first ones, and dresses up every Sunday because she enjoys the worship experience. She enjoys it. So, you know, we haven't lost anyone. And like I said, we've gained. And I haven't had any arrows thrown at me, so.
All right, so just one final question. How do white churches continue to benefit under white supremacy culture, or do they benefit? I see a lot of head nodding, but anyone want to
ask the question again?
How do white churches continue to benefit under white supremacy culture? Or I guess really, do white churches benefit under white supremacy culture?
I think that's a at least two-pronged question. And it's very complex, because the assumption is, and I look in the present political situation, the true believers, they more closely cling and adhere to what they truly believe. If as in the statistics I gave earlier, if that's your bent, if that's your inclination, then you're going to try to make sure that's where you align yourself. So and there are a number of so-called Christian hate groups and Christian hate denominations, and I say Christian in air quotes, I want everybody to see them, because we know that's not what Christ said. So I think those groups are probably prospering. But I also think the other thing is happening too, that people are realizing that as those people like folks on the line today and people in the discussions with the SDRJ meetings, we interact with one another. I think that we're finding that's not who the majority of folk are and what they are. And we're realizing that it might be a matter of convenience. It might be a matter of access. But I believe that white supremacy as a doctrine seems to be increasing because the media tells us that it is so, but I think in the real world it's not, and it's evidenced by poll numbers, even for those people who claim to speak for that group right now. And I don't call names, I don't talk about people, but let's see where it's going. So I don't know. That's kind of a loaded kind of triple pronged question, and there's really a right answer. But it's a question for much thinking for a whole new presentation sometime in the future. That's a really tricky question. Okay, but that's interesting.
That white churches benefit from white supremacy in ways that probably are not as obvious. I think one of the conversations we've been having in the United Methodist Church, and particularly in our annual conference, is the difference in clergy salary between African-American pastors and white pastors. And so if you look at economically, African-American pastors who have served the same number of years and have the same level of education are nowhere near paid the same amount as white pastors. So, you can say, well, that's not directly related to white supremacy, but I think it is, because it's that economic power that keeps people oppressed, that then does not allow for the kind of resources, so if you look back at, GIs, African-American GIs who came back from serving in World War II, came back and were not allowed access to the GI Bill where they could go to college. And they were not allowed access to the housing, all veterans get a VHA housing benefit, and they weren't allowed access to that. And, that again travels down generations that continues to impact people. And so when you don't have that kind of economic power, then there's not the resources to continue to do the kinds of ministries, and as well as to pay the pastors for what they're worth. So we're really wrestling with that in our conference right now, and ways to address how we deal with that inequity in salary. So it's not an obvious way necessarily, but it is a powerful way that white supremacy still has economic power within the white church that negatively impacts and oppresses the Black churches.
Other panelists want to comment on that?
I think we've reached the end, and I know for me, my gratitude is so tremendous, because for me, this has been a learning experience. Each of you have taught me so much and given me so much insight into what goes on in your parish. So I thank you for that, and I assume that our audience has learned as much as I've learned, or you posed questions for me to continue to think about. And I think, as you have suggested, Pastor Griffin, we will continue the conversation. We may invite you back at some time to follow up on some of these questions. I want to thank all of you for the time and for the investment. For me personally, it was a wonderful learning experience. Reverend Mariano, I want to thank you for moderating. I know moderation is a challenging job.
This group made it very easy. Thank you very much for being really interesting. Well, I want to say more than interesting, inspiring responders. I worked hard on those questions, and you really went with them, and I feel really satisfied that we were able to have touch upon something that is important for all of us to hear. How we were, and Unitarian Universalist isn't Christian, but when I say we're mainly a white denomination, and how we all culturally have been growing and transforming and moving into the call of Jesus and of the beloved community.
Well, I thank all of you, and that was nice closing words, Reverend Mariano, so I do appreciate that. And look forward to seeing all of you in further discussion. It was very nice meeting you, Reverend Vicky, and I hope we will continue conversations. And Calvin, thank you for holding us together as usual.
Okay.